Can a seemingly legal maneuver on the track end up destroying an entire season? What if Norris overtaking Tsunoda in Abu Dhabi was the beginning of the end for McLaren? Stay, because what you're about to hear could change everything. During the 2025 Abu Dhabi Grand Prix, a moment of extremely high tension occurred that quickly became the epicenter of an unprecedented investigation. It was lap 23 at the Yas Marina circuit. At that moment, Lando Norris was approaching Yuki Tsunoda on the long back straight that leads to the complicated Turn 5. An area where overtaking is possible, but also extremely risky due to sudden braking and the proximity of the walls. Norris, with a McLaren MCL 39 loaded with pace and clearly superior in top speed, executed the classic movement, getting out of the wake of the car in front, opening to the left and positioning himself on the outside in the braking zone. But what happened next turned that movement into a ticking time bomb. Tsunoda, in his last race with Red Bull, did not limit himself to a standard defense. Deliberately, he made a first movement inward, partially closing the trajectory. Up to here legal. However, when Norris was already engaged in his maneuver, the Japanese made a second change of direction, this time moving abruptly to the outside, visually and physically pushing the McLaren towards the limits of the asphalt. Norris, who was already in the braking phase and could not simply disappear, was forced to go off the track with all four wheels off the track to avoid a direct collision. The maneuver was violent, unexpected, and, above all, caused an extreme situation where the priority was no longer overtaking, but rather avoiding an accident. In the subsequent moments, an immediate alert was activated by the FIA. The action was recorded by multiple cameras, and from the first seconds, the team of commissioners took note to begin a double investigation. On the one hand, they had to evaluate whether Norris had gained a significant advantage by overtaking outside the circuit limits. And on the other hand, if Tsunoda had violated the article of the sporting regulations that prevents making more than one change of direction with defensive intent, especially in braking zones where the safety margins are minimal. But what raised the seriousness of the matter was not only the action on the track. During the review of the audio material, FIA investigators found a radio transmission from the Red Bull wall to Tsunoda's car with a clear message: make it difficult for the McLaren to advance. That is to say, it was a strategically instructed defense, not a spontaneous reaction by the pilot. This political and ethical factor set off all the alarms. The context could not be more delicate. Norris arrived in Abu Dhabi as Max Verstappen's main rival for the world title. Every point counted. Each maneuver could tip the balance of the championship. And at that precise moment, in a critical maneuver, the fight was altered by an action that is now not only sporting, but threatens to have regulatory, structural, and potentially catastrophic consequences for McLaren. The question was no longer just whether Norris advanced cleanly, but whether he was the victim of an illegal defense executed under orders from the rival team. This completely changed the nature of the incident and made it clear that we were dealing with a much more complex case than it seemed on screen. Once the controversial maneuver between Lando Norris and Yuki Tsunoda was placed under investigation, a rigorous technical process began that represents one of the most thorough analyses ever carried out by the FIA on a modern Formula One event. This was not a simple review of television images or a conversation with the teams involved. It was a truly high-level forensic operation with full access to real-time data, imaging, and communications tools. All with a single objective: to determine the responsibility of each driver, and above all, to establish whether Norris overtaking occurred under legal conditions or if it violated any part of the sporting regulations. The starting point was the review of the ultra-high-definition aerial images, recorded from the official F1 helicopter and complemented by the onboard cameras of both cars. These images, analyzed frame by frame, confirmed what was felt viscerally on the track. Tsunoda not only made one defensive movement, but two, and both under braking. It first closed inward, forcing Norris to modify his approach path. But what was critical was the second movement, this time to the outside, when Norris was already engaged in the attack. This second detour not only reduced the available space, but literally eliminated any possible safe route for the McLaren. There was the wall to the left and Tsunoda to the right. There was no way out. The McLaren MCL 39 telemetry provided the next level of detail. At the exact moment of the maneuver, it was observed how Norris applied 97% of brake pressure, maintained an aggressive steering angle towards the outside, and avoided total wheel lock for just a few milliseconds. These data reveal something compelling. Norris did not leave the track looking for an advantage, but rather trying to avoid an imminent impact. The car's behavior was that of a driver reacting to an unexpected obstacle, not one trying to force an illegal overtake. But the analysis did not end there. The projected trajectories of both vehicles were also evaluated. Using computer simulations, the researchers recreated the maneuver scenario using exact speed, braking, and steering data. These simulations confirmed that if Norris had braked even harder to avoid going off the track, it would have caused a complete closure of the escape angle, which would most likely have resulted in a high-energy side collision. The simulation system even calculated that the point of impact would have occurred at a speed greater than 210 km per hour, with possibly disastrous consequences for both cars. Meanwhile, the telemetry of Tsunoda's RB21 showed a correction pattern in the steering wheel that indicated deliberate changes in direction. Most importantly, these corrections were made without loss of traction or brake lockup, suggesting they were conscious movements, not reactions to an imbalance in the car. All this was confirmed by the analysis of data from the electronic steering system, which recorded very precise peaks of manual input, reinforcing the hypothesis of an orchestrated defense. Added to this technical body of testing were audio records of the communication between Tsunoda and his race engineer. The content, although not fully revealed to the public, was shared in part by the FIA and confirms a direct instruction to make it difficult for the McLaren to pass. This point was decisive because it turns an aggressive defensive maneuver into a potentially unsportsmanlike action with overtones of strategic manipulation within the regulations. The commissioners, faced with this mountain of intersecting evidence, completely redefined the focus of the investigation. What at first seemed like a possible infraction on the part of Norris ended up becoming a technical and regulatory justification for his actions. Furthermore, the analysis made it clear that, had he not acted as he did, the result would have been a crash with potentially much more serious implications. The technical evidence not only changed the perspective of the case, it reversed it. The incident between Lando Norris and Yuki Tsunoda, far from remaining just another controversial maneuver in the championship, has escalated to a much deeper dimension that directly involves the sport's regulatory leadership and puts the regulatory stability of the 2025 championship in check. For McLaren, the repercussions could be critical. And for the FIA, they represent a legitimacy challenge that cannot be ignored. But the problem is even more structural. What is at stake is not only the result of a Grand Prix, but the legal sports precedent that this case may set. If the FIA decides that Norris will not be penalized, it will be officially recognizing that a driver can leave the track with all four wheels in an evasive maneuver without being penalized, as long as telemetry supports that he did so to avoid an accident. This would redefine the interpretation of the article that regulates runway limits. It would be a de facto modification of the regulations, without having gone through the formal review process that requires consensus between the teams. On the other hand, if they choose to sanction it, they would open another front of controversy. They would be penalizing a defensive maneuver that, in its essence, sought to avoid a collision. And most seriously, the fact that it was caused by an illegal defense, instructed by the rival team, would be ignored. This would fuel theories of favoritism, political pressure exerted by certain high-powered teams, and would even call into question the FIA's commitment to track safety, since it would punish a driver for choosing not to crash. This case, more than a simple dispute between McLaren and Red Bull, has struck a sensitive chord within the paddock, the line between strategic and unsportsmanlike. And until there is a definitive verdict, everything remains in suspense. The teams take note, the pilots analyze, and fans, increasingly demanding, await not only a resolution, but a clear demonstration that Formula One remains a competition where the rules are applied fairly and without exceptions. This context allows us to understand why Red Bull could have instructed Yuki Tsunoda to make an aggressive defensive maneuver. It was not an improvised technical decision. It was a chess move. In a scenario where every point counts, blocking the progress of a direct rival even through a driver who is on his way out, like Tsunoda, becomes a political tool. Even more so when that driver no longer has to report to the team in the long term, freeing him from future consequences. It is a tactic that goes beyond the competitive spirit and enters the territory of deliberate manipulation of the game. Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.